Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my latest in my series of videos about where not to start with various authors. This time I wanted to do where not to start with Kurt Vonnegut. So I thought before I did that I would share some of my opinions about Vonnegut, some of the things I think are some of the best, some of the books that I think are among his worst, where I wouldn't recommend starting, and then as I almost always do, leave a list of books where I think it's better to start, some places to start with Kurt Vonnegut in terms of his reading. So before I get to that, let me just say that I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut in my 20s, my 1920s. I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut in my 20s. I found his sense of humor to be clever, his books to be appealing, his ideas to be ones that that kind of resonated with me. And since then, I've come to kind of see see some flaws in Vonnegut and flaws in Vonnegut's work, and in kind of what seemed to me to be almost a formulaic pattern to his work, particularly his later work. And so I kind of fell out of my infatuation with Vonnegut and stopped reading him, and really stopped talking or thinking about him much altogether. And that may be where I decide to leave him. What I want to do with this kind of list is just, if you're just starting with Vonnegut, to warn you away from certain books of Vonnegut that I just don't think are worth your time, but then to kind of draw attention to some books by Vonnegut that I think might be much better places to start. So the first book I would tell you that I would avoid, the first place where I would not start in reading Kurt Vonnegut, is with Breakfast of Champions. I believe this was his sixth novel, and essentially it tells a story of a meeting between a businessman and essentially a relatively nondescript Midwestern town meeting with an author named Kilgore Trout, who's a recurring character in Vonnegut, who is not a very successful author, and their meeting kind of has a cataclysmic impact on the life of the businessman, and kind of an opposite impact on the life of the author. I think this might have been the first Vonnegut book I read, and it's got these drawings that Vonnegut did himself, interspersed with the text. Some of them are really basic. There are a few that I would think of, maybe the best term for them would be off color, which I won't show you that one, but if you look at the picture above it, you get some idea of what that one's about. And I think this is a bad place to start with Vonnegut, not necessarily because the story is bad, even though I don't think the story is necessarily all that good or interesting in the long run, and I think oftentimes it's weighed down by just kind of clever ideas that Vonnegut had about life and death and sanity, etc. Anyway, but the pictures, I think, if that's where you start with Vonnegut, you may think that those kinds of pictures or that kind of unusual approach to storytelling and to creating text are going to be common. I think it gives you kind of a bad impression, or the wrong impression, maybe not a bad impression, the wrong impression of Vonnegut. And I do think the book is a little bit sophomoric, if I can use that term. Later in his career, the big problem I have with Vonnegut is that his stories seem to become just incredibly formulaic. Something terrible has gone wrong. Something's gone wrong with humanity. Something's gone wrong in these people's lives. They live their lives increasingly isolated, and because they're isolated, he's able to kind of hyper-focus on certain issues involving them or that these characters symbolize. And to me, that kind of plays out over and over again in Vonnegut's later work, whether we're talking about Jailbird or Bluebird, which I think was Bluebeard, which I think was his next to his last novel, or the two I'm going to mention here, which I really think could just be completely avoided. The first of those is Slapstick. I believe this novel was published sometime in the 1970s, and it's basically about a brother and sister, even though the story, not surprisingly, is told by the brother. And the brother and sister kind of function as an effective and incredibly intelligent human being if they're together. And they come up with this plan where nobody will ever be lonely again, because they'll kind of create these artificial extended families, and at some point they are part of kind of the decline, or their goals are kind of part of the decline of the Western civilization, American civilization, and we see the rise of the Chinese, who kind of in Slapstick take on the role that maybe the Tralfalmadorians took on in Slaughterhouse 5, and the themes that are present in a lot of Faulkner, themes that are present in a lot of Vonnegut, hopefully I've been saying Vonnegut and not Faulkner, the things that are present in a lot of Vonnegut's work are really present here. You know, is there free will? Is life worth living? The existential crisis that we all face, knowing, you know, that death is out there and there's nothing we can do about it, and that perhaps the events that take place around us are beyond our control, and how do we live our days knowing that, you know, things are random and we don't have any. Anyway, those themes are in Slapstick, and I think it's really not that much different than a number of his other books. You know, in Bluebeard there's an artist, in Jailbird there is a member of the Nixon administration. In Slapstick there's this brother and sister who are kind of entrepreneurs and political figures who are trying to, you know, save and salvage American civilization, which, by the way, you should know Vonnegut does not think is worth saving or salvaging. They just kind of all, in my mind, kind of run together. I think, by the way, Hocus Pocus would be another. I think that's Vonnegut's last book, would be another on those lists. So that would not start with Slapstick either. And the third book of Vonnegut's I would not start with is the book Galapagos. And this is because this is just the weirdest one. You need to know, if you don't already know, Kurt Vonnegut really started off as a science fiction writer. And as a result, his I guess we're going to call it literary fiction, never gets far away from some of the basic precepts of science fiction. And that is that I think oftentimes his books start out with kind of what I'm going to call a gimmick. There's something that kind of otherworldly, weird science fiction that happens, and in Galapagos it is essentially that humanity has lost the ability to reproduce, I think, except for a group of human beings who take refuge on the Galapagos Islands, and then over 1 million years they evolve into these creatures who are kind of like seals, I think. Anyway, it's a really weird story in which, you know, the writer from Breakfast of Champions, among others, Kilgore Trout, shows up and attempts to kind of talk these people into going ahead and passing over and just letting go of life. And anyway, it's really weird and it's confusing and it's just not very good. And I wouldn't start with Galapagos either. So as I do in these videos, I'll also point out 3 books that I think are great places to start with reading Kurt Vonnegut. The best place to start, and maybe the place to start and end, is with his masterpiece, Slaughterhouse 5. This tells the story of Billy Pilgrim, who is an American POW captured by the Germans, who witnesses the firebombing of Dresden, who is captured by space aliens named called Tralfamadorians, and they are constantly. It kind of presents this position, this idea about what is reality and what is time, and can human beings affect the outcome of their own lives or world events, and calls into question why things happen, and is there a purpose behind anything. It is also a fairly brilliant, I think, anti-war statement, and it is an interesting and I think unique book. Which, you know, really launched, I think, Vonnegut's career. The second book, by the way, the fellows over at Codex Cantina have a great video about Slaughterhouse 5, and there's some others I've seen recently, and I'll list the name of the channel right here, and I'll put a link to those down below. They'll tell you a lot more about the themes and ideas in Slaughterhouse 5 than I ever could. The second place maybe to start with Kurt Vonnegut is where Vonnegut started, and that is with his first novel, Player Piano. Player Piano is really a science fiction novel which deals with human beings and their struggles in an increasingly automated world. I found this book to be really good and interesting. For a first novel, I thought it was pretty effective. I think that Vonnegut had been writing for a long time for science fiction magazines by the time this book came out, but this would be another good place to start. By the way, the fellows at the Codex Cantina also have, you know, a good video, or a series of good videos about Player Piano. I'll leave links to those below. And then the final book I'd recommend, maybe as a place to start, if you just happen to see it at a used bookstore and you want to read Vonnegut and you haven't yet, of all the Vonnegut novels that I think that come kind of in that later period of his career where I don't think he was producing particularly great works, my favorite is Dead-Eye Dick. Dead-Eye Dick tells the story of a young man who commits a horrible crime on accident and then essentially lives with that guilt, tortures himself with that guilt, even though events that take place after that seem to maybe erase any reason why he would feel guilty or why that would take place or why he would be burdened by that. I thought this one was at least an interesting premise, a little bit more realistic. Maybe that's why I like it in terms of the event, the catalyst event, which sets everything in motion. So if you're going to read one of those kind of later Kurt Vonnegut novels, this would be the one I would suggest. Anyway, there you go. If you're a lover of Kurt Vonnegut, a defender of his work, and anything I said here has offended you or disagree, or if I've made a mistake, please let me know in the comments section down below. I'm kind of in the process of thinking about maybe rereading some Vonnegut to see if my opinion still holds. But these are my opinions right now about the best places to start, and more importantly, where not to start with Kurt Vonnegut. Anyway, as always, look forward to your comments, and thank you for watching.